some kind of a global crisis. If any explosion happens, it will be a big explosion. Because if we think that we are not going to be a great power, we'll never become a great power. And the reality is that the global system is dominated by the United States.
It's high time that India should become a member of the UNSC.
What would India say to taking China's place in the Security Council? And Nehruji said no. He was so enamored of China. No. China must have its place. India will have its own place. This kind of romanticized thinking. Power is always taken, never given.
Very true. In 2024, Chinese is the biggest exporter to India now again.
How do you convince your defense forces that your indigenously produced defense equipment is actually up to the mark and they don't have to buy everything from abroad? How do they become a number one power in the world if they cannot be number one in Asia? The Chinese owe a lot to India. Mao told him, he says, in China we have a belief that if you have led a good and a virtuous life, then you will be reborn in the Western kingdom, which is India. Today you can't find a toaster which is made in India.
Are these perspectives reaching the top management and top leadership?
Well,
today we have the honor of hosting a renowned diplomat and author, Ambassador Rajiv Sikri. With over 36 years of experience in the Indian Foreign Service, Ambassador Sikri has been at the forefront of India's diplomacy across the globe. From serving in Kazakhstan, Moscow, and New York to holding key position in India's Ministry of External Affairs. He has seen it all. And in this episode, we'll be exploring his latest book, Strategic Conundrums, Rethinking India's Foreign Policy, which offers a fresh, nuanced approach to India's foreign policy challenges in the 21st century. Ambassador Sikri encourages a rethinking of India's diplomatic and strategic framework, particularly as the country navigates its complex relationships with China and Pakistan, while maintaining a positive global reputation. We'll discuss India's need for an integrated approach to decision making, how diplomacy can complement military strategy, and the future of India's strategic autonomy. Ambassador Sikri offers his insight on China's internal vulnerabilities, the failure of the UN Security Council, and how India can leverage its soft and hard power to become the center of Asia and a true global power. If you're passionate about understanding the intricacies of global diplomacy and India's rise on the world stage, this conversation is a must-watch for you. Let's get started. Before we dive into today's conversation, I just wanted to take a quick moment. We looked at our analytics and noticed that 93% of you who watch our videos regularly aren't subscribed yet. If you're enjoying our content and want us to keep going with more insightful conversation, we'd really appreciate if you could take just a second to subscribe. It might seem like a small action, but it goes a long way in helping us grow and bringing even more amazing content your way. Thanks for your support. It means the world to us. Now let's get back to the video. Welcome, sir.
thank you for inviting me to your show.
It's my pleasure to have you, sir. So I would like to start a conversation on your new book.
Yes, it's just been published and it's titled Strategic Conundrums, Reshaping India's Foreign Policy. I think it's an attempt by me to address a larger audience in India, not just specialists and those dealing with defense, security, foreign affairs, but I think a larger readership, an audience across India, curious, intellectually aware people, particularly young people, who are not specialists but who want to understand better what is happening in the world, in India, what are our problems, how to resolve them. Because I think in today's world, which is more interconnected than ever, all of us have to deal with foreign affairs in some way, whether you are workers looking for jobs abroad, whether you're businessmen, traders looking for markets, importing, looking for investments, students going abroad, tourists going abroad, and so forth. You know, whether you can get oil from countries or what are our exports, your computers. So all this depends on our interaction with foreign countries.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important that if India is to become Viksit Bharat, as the Prime Minister has set as a goal, a very laudable goal by 2047, then it has to be a whole of country approach, that everyone has to play their role in taking it forward. So that is the broader objective behind my book. I have tried to focus a lot on our neighborhood because I think that is critical. I looked at relations with major players which affect our foreign and security policy, but particularly the major powers in the world. And I think that today we are at a very critical turning point in world affairs because the structures and institutions that are in place were those that have been inherited from the end of the Second World War, whether it is Security Council, UN, GATT, WTO, IMF, World Bank, and so forth. But the world has changed. The power balance has shifted. And today we are again, I think, in the middle of some kind of a global crisis because you have major powers who are members of the Security Council quarreling, fighting with one another. So the UN Security Council doesn't work. I mean, this is unprecedented that you have one major player, the United States, seeking the strategic defeat of Russia, which is the largest nuclear power. Now, this is highly dangerous. We have been given lectures from time to time about how Kashmir is a nuclear flashpoint between India and Pakistan. But what is happening in Ukraine is an even more dangerous flashpoint. I don't think we have ever seen a situation where, there is no conversation, no dialogue between the West and Russia. And this time it's the West which has put an iron curtain on Russia. So this has global consequences, as we know. Then there's the Gaza war, which threatens to spill over into a much wider regional conflict. It has in fact spread a bit, but it has the potential to do. There are, other problems created by China, whether it is
In Taiwan
or the South China Sea,
Absolutely.
or what they are doing with us. So these are very uncertain and difficult times, and India has to navigate these turbulent waters very carefully if we are to preserve our national interests, our security. And my book is an attempt to say, okay, now what do we do? And because there are no easy answers, that's why I've titled it Strategic Conundrums, because answers are not always clear-cut. A lot depends on what is our assessment of the state of the world.
True.
A lot depends on what do other players think and do.
Especially on geopolitics when it's so dynamic, changes every day.
Absolutely. So you cannot say that I will do this. Maybe your perspective will change after a few years in the light of developments that take place. And it's also, what kind of national strength and power you have, and what kind of vision and goal you have for your own country. Because if we think that we are not going to be a great power, we'll never become a great power. You must have an ambition and a goal and work towards it in proper leadership. And you must have a general support of the country. Unfortunately, many political personalities which are seeking interference in our internal affairs, when you have sections of our political and intellectual elite who are constantly running down India, and ordinary people also. I mean, our Indians go abroad and say, India is this, that, you criticize India. That's not conducive to making India a strong power. So these are some of the problems that we have, which I've discussed in the book, and tried to offer, I wouldn't say solutions, but suggestions. And people may or may not agree with them, but my idea is to stimulate a debate. I think that Indians should be thinking about these issues and seeing what they, in their own way, can do to help build India.
Wow, sir. So you very rightly said that there's a world is in turmoil at the moment.
Yeah.
There's conflicts happening around the world, and we can also see a shift in power dynamics from the west to the east. But amidst this, sir, what do you think about India's stand in the terms of foreign policy? Foreign policy can be divided into three different parts. One could be diplomacy, could be security, could be trade, and many other things. But how do you think India is tackling this kind of change in the power dynamics at the moment, sir?
Well, I think that foreign policy is holistic. It's not in three parts, as you said, because military power, economic power, and strategic perspectives are all elements of that thing. You have to work in tandem. You may have goals, but if you don't have the resources, how are you going to achieve them? Obviously, the first thing is that you must have a proper strategic perspective, that you must think strategically. Now, you have the United States, which thinks that it is the indispensable nation. They are very convinced that without them, the world can't run.
True.
The American president thinks that he, or maybe she now, is going to run the world.
Yeah.
And in many ways they do. And you have the Chinese who think, well, we were the Middle Kingdom, we are the Middle Kingdom, and so on and so forth. So what do we think of ourselves? Do we think of ourselves only as a small country or with no ambitions? Or do we hark back to our past and our vision of the future that, no, we also have a place in the world. And then how do you go about it? So I think that you can have the ambitions, but then do you have the military firepower? Do you have the military strength? Do you have the technology? Do you have the economy? Do you have the social cohesion? Do you have political support? All these elements will go together to make a successful nation and a successful foreign policy.
Absolutely, sir. So, since you spoke about how we perceive ourselves, I must ask you, because you are in that environment, what is the sentiment of our leadership, diplomacy at the moment in terms of how we want to see India on a global stage?
I think that after Mr. Modi became the Prime Minister, certainly we have a much clearer strategic vision, a realization that we need to engage with a much broader range of countries and actors than we did hitherto. Mr. Modi's travels, for example, he has traveled so extensively, visiting countries and regions which were earlier neglected.
Sure.
The latest is, of course, Poland and Ukraine. But he's been to Africa, to Latin America, to the Pacific Islands. Not just Mr. Modi, but the whole establishment. Because what happens in all these parts of the world affects us. The second thing, which is quite remarkable, is that if you know that Mr. Modi was denied a US visa for 10 years.
Yes, and he was a CM.
So many people thought that, when he becomes Prime Minister, he's going to be very upset with the Americans. Nothing of the kind.
That was nice to see.
He said, I have to look at my country's national interest. And therefore, I have come to the conclusion that good relations with the United States is in India's interest. So let me work towards that. And he has done that, setting aside any personal grievance or prejudice that he may have had. He may not have had it. So that's a realistic approach. It's not that with the United States everything is hunky-dory. We have our differences.
True.
We have our points of divergence. Many of them will not go away because it is obvious the United States will follow its own interests. We have to follow our own interests. We want to rise higher. Never easy to rise because the established players will not give you a place on the table easily. So we have to fight our way up. But we have to see what are our points of convergence. That how do we manage that? What are our key areas where we have to stand our ground, and others where, we may have to compromise. Take Russia. It's a very important relationship, the successor state to the Soviet Union. And Russia has always been a good friend. So despite all the pressures that were put on India, we have stood by Russia and they have stood by us. And it's very important. We get a lot of technology from them. Our defense is highly dependent on Russia. We get political support. They're doing nothing which goes against our interests.
Energy as well.
Energy, of course, now. So it's an important relationship. We need the Europeans because they have technology, there's a big market, and so forth. But then we have problematic relationships with our neighbors, China, Pakistan. So we have to manage all this. I think Mr. Modi has a strategic perspective and a goal, and that is very important. I do hope that leaders who come to power in the succeeding decades will have a similar perspective, and that that there will be a national consensus on how to take India forward, rather than bickering amongst ourselves, and sometimes remarks are made, "Aap Russia kyun gaye, Manipur kyun nahi gaye?" That kind of thing is not very helpful.
Your book speaks about rethinking foreign policy, sir. In a way, India holds a lot of wisdom from our ancient manuscripts as well. Have you included any of the knowledge from that book in terms of how to increase our stature in the foreign policy?
No, I think that our traditions are very good. After all, Kautilya's Arthashastra is a guide to policy. And I think that till about 1000 AD, when the Muslim invasions began, India was a very well-run society and polity. And it had the imagination of the whole world, for good reason. Because let's not forget that a lot of knowledge, including scientific knowledge, came from our rishis and munis and the Vedas and so forth. It has become fashionable now to decry anything. He says, nahi, ye kaise ho sakta? We imagine that the world started with Greece and Rome and so forth, but we have our own traditions that we have lost. And today, there is a rediscovery of that. A conscious attempt to rediscover our roots, our strengths. I think we should not belittle our past. In the north, of course, a lot of the temples and so forth were destroyed by Muslim invaders. That's why Gangetic Plain, you don't see any old temples, and wherever there are some, there's now controversy whether it was Kashi or Mathura or Ayodhya and so forth. But if you go to the south, you see some fantastic works which are there. You go to Rajasthan, you go to Gujarat, which have been spared, and you realize that there was huge talent and huge sophistication. Let me mention one important factor. For the rest of the world, India was the fabled land. All the European explorers came looking for India. Christopher Columbus was looking for India. It's just that he reached the Dominican Republic, now the Dominican Republic, and he said, I've reached India. Vasco da Gama came here looking for India. He found it. This ocean is called the Indian Ocean for a reason, because we dominate it. The people whom the Europeans found on the American continent were what? Red Indians, Maya Indians, Aztec Indians, called it the West Indies. Why? Because it was what they were looking for. The name India, as you know, comes from the Indus River or the Sindh River. And India was the land beyond the Indus. And that's why we call Hindi. Even today, you go to the Arab world, they say you're Hindi. So that is, what is a Hindu? A Hindu is a person who lives in the land, as far as the West is concerned, beyond the Indus. And this is a whole civilization that we have. So India historically has been a civilization, not confined to its present post-partition borders, but a vast space extended, I would say, from the Hindu Kush to the Irrawaddy. And then our influence extended to Southeast Asia. There were so many kingdoms in what is now Java, Sumatra, the Champa, the others. You have Angkor Wat, which is a huge complex. You have in Indonesia, Borobudur, Buddhist temple. You have the Prambanan. In Thailand, you have there's a place called Ayodhya.
Yes.
They haven't lost that culture. Even though some of these countries are now Buddhist or Islamic, they still have that connection. And similarly, Indian influence spread to Africa, to the Gulf. The Gulf, as you know, was connected with India till a few decades ago. Indian money was very current there because this is the largest civilization, most developed civilization. And you saw it also in Central Asia. So what I'm trying to suggest is that India was always the center of a very important part of the world, which enjoyed prestige and success, both because of its inherent strengths and also because of a favorable geographical location. Now, we have to take advantage of our strengths and minimize our weaknesses. Unfortunately, India was divided, and I think a role in this was played not just by the Muslim League, but also by the British. And now the documents have come out, which is quite open, that the British wanted to keep the strategic part of India, which is now Pakistan, the gateway to the West, under their control. And I'm sorry to say, I think that our leaders in the initial years, Mr. Nehru and others, did not take a strategic view of India's security. Our view was confined to the borders of post-partition India. So you did not react when Tibet happened. You did not take the opportunity of having Baluchistan as a part of India. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan wanted Afghanistan to be part of India. You did not accept it. In 1958, the Sultan of Oman said, Gwadar port le lijiye. Nahi, humko nahi chahiye. You had members of parliament who raised in, I think, 62, question that in parliament that, but Kailash Mansarovar is India. This is a very holy place for us.
Yes. For
centuries, pilgrims have been going there, the abode of Lord Shiva. And you know what Nehruji's reply was? Ye koi zamindari thodi hai ki hum le lenge. You have this POK and this Gilgit-Baltistan. This is all under the Kashmir Raja. But you did not, when you threw out the invaders, you did not or could not go there and take it. Today, that territory which connects Pakistan-occupied Kashmir with Chinese-occupied East Turkestan has become a strategic nightmare for you. So I think that we have to have a strategic perspective, first of all. The second is that you must have a proper interface between military power and diplomacy. I think it has been rightly said that war is too serious a business to be left to the generals. And in any case, when you go to a war, the end result has to be determined by diplomacy.
True.
You have to sit down eventually at a table and say, okay, this is what we're going to decide. You have to see how you can use diplomacy to wage war. For example, to have the Indo-Soviet Treaty of 1971 before the operations in Bangladesh. We got a good victory, but we lost that in Simla. So diplomacy failed us where the military victory was there. We take Sri Lanka 87. Our general said, we can do this. Turned out to be a disaster. So that's the second aspect, that you have to look at the military aspects of it. Do you have your own indigenous capabilities? Now we are going in for Atmanirbharta and Make in India, which is very good. Because in a crisis situation, you don't know what would be denied to you.
True.
And thirdly, of course, there is the economic aspect. You must have the economic, financial strength.
So I would pick on a point that you said that any warlike situation, a conflict situation, always includes the military part of it and the diplomacy part of it. We are seeing that there has been an integration on the military part of it at the moment, with theaterization and bringing NDA DMA, with getting the CDS DMA. So how does a country integrate diplomacy and security?
As you know, all security decisions in India are taken at the highest level by the Cabinet Committee on Security. And that mechanism ensures that all the stakeholders are on board. Because the composition of that committee is, of course, the Prime Minister, but it has the Defense Minister, the External Affairs Minister, the Home Minister, the Finance Minister. I don't know now if they've included the National Security Advisor or not. The idea is that when you are deciding these issues, you cannot see it in isolation. Because the Foreign Ministry may say, we have to do this. The Defense Ministry will say, well, no, this is a problem there. Or the Finance will say, I don't have the money. Or the Army says, I want so many thousands of crores. Again, you may not have money.
Yeah.
The Home Minister will say, hello, there's a domestic problem also. What do we do there? So these are issues that require an integrated approach. And often this is not clear to people outside the system, that what are the considerations that go into decision making. Very often people who are sitting from outside say, oh no, it's there. But these are armchair solutions that we are offering. You're not in the driving seat where you understand what are the constraints, what are the pressures. There could be external pressures that you cannot meet. Somebody says, now take for example, the secondary sanctions that the United States imposes on countries doing business with Russia or Iran. That constrains us. Can we get away from those sanctions? We try to, we talk to them. But then we have to adjust. Sometimes we can defy them, sometimes we can't. And the reality is that the global system is dominated by the United States, whether it is in terms of stock markets, finance, technology, investments, the dollar, military power, digital world. All your platforms are US controlled. So you may want to ignore it, but in practice you can't. And even when the government says you can do business, an individual company will say, oh, I've got too many stakes in country A, I can't risk that. So that becomes a problem. Or take the thing about China. We're always talking about imports from China and so forth. Now the businessman says, I make more money if I shut down my factory here and import from China.
Yeah.
That's against our national interest. But how do you convince the businessman that he should, in the long run, be better off there? Or how do you convince industry that they should invest more in R&D, in fundamental research? How do you convince your defense forces that your indigenously produced defense equipment is actually up to the mark and they don't have to buy everything from abroad? So these are some of the problems that we are facing.
So before I get to the next question, I have the urge to say how much I'm enjoying this conversation, getting the perspective from you, because I get this perspective a lot and never have I gotten such a positive and a hopeful response on these subjects. Having said that, sir, we also spoke about the neighborhood policy at the moment. There is also all sort of problem in our neighborhood right now. We have problems with Pakistan, in China, and there's a lot of our neighborhood have a sentiment of India out.
Yeah.
What is your take on that, sir? I would love to hear that.
This is a question over which I have thought somewhat, and which I think a lot of Indians are also wondering, why does India have such bad relations with its neighbors? I think living with neighbors is always never easy. It's the same when you're living in a colony. You have to get along with your neighbors, and you don't always do that. There could be so many issues. But when it comes to India's neighbors, I think the fundamental problem is that all of India's current neighbors, which are sovereign states now, have become independent countries only in the last few decades. Earlier, they were part of what is the civilizational India. Even if you take British India, it extended from, as I said, the Hindu Kush to the Irrawaddy.
Yeah.
And Ceylon was also a part of it. Myanmar was there till the 1930s as part of it. So many Indians went to Myanmar, and then, when the government came, a lot of them got kicked out after 1962. So there is a fundamental conflict, I think, in the thinking of our neighbors, that who are they? Do they is their identity more a civilizational identity of the civilization that exists in this part of the world? Because if you look at any of our neighbors, there is always some commonality with the neighboring region of India. You take Nepal, Madheshis, or you take Paharis and the people of Darjeeling and Sikkim and so forth. You take Pakistan. What is the difference between a Pakistani Punjabi and a Hindu Punjabi in terms of language, food, culture,
The
way
historical
of thinking,
significance as well.
way of thinking, gali galoj, everything is the same.
Food.
So, you meet a Pakistani abroad, if you're from North India, he's so thrilled to be able to
You
talk
connect
to
immediately. Immediately
Yeah.
you connect.
Now, this is a problem for them that at one level there is that tug towards India. But at the same time, now that they are separate states, how do they define their new identity? And that has to be, you have to distance yourself from India. When you distance yourself, then you become anti-Indian.
Yeah.
Then you say all the problems which happen are because of India.
Yeah.
So you become a bogey, you become the scapegoat for anything that happens in India. Now take Bangladesh. They were part of Pakistan. And you know that the Muslim League started there, and it was the Calcutta riots, which was a big trigger for partition. So at that time they were behaving like Muslims, Islamists. The Islamic element in their character was strong. Then in 71, when they broke away, it was culture, their Bengali culture, language, which came to the fore. So they oscillate between, are they Islamic or Bengali? They're a dual personality.
Yes.
So whichever comes to the fore, then you have this thing. You take the problems in Sri Lanka. Sinhala versus Tamil. That has been the conflict there. And they're trying to create their own identity as a Buddhist Sinhala nation. But you can't deny that there are these Tamils. And when something is happening to Tamils there, people in Tamil Nadu feel upset. Or Nepal. You had this Madheshi problem a few years ago. It's a continuing thing that if they are ill-treated, then people in India feel upset about it. You take now what is happening in Mizoram. There's common ethnicity between the people on the Chin states and Mizoram and Manipur. So you have people who are relatives who come across. So there is no clean-cut dividing line between India and its neighbor. There's no clean-cut geographical boundaries. There's no natural boundaries between India and its
That's
neighbor.
a plus point for us.
I don't know if it's a plus point or not, it's a fact that normally, there has to be some natural features, like you have maybe some mountain ranges or major river or something, or a desert, which will define one country or region from another.
Absolutely.
India, Pakistan, what is the dividing line? The Radcliffe line, which is drawn on a map, or between India and Bangladesh, or India and Nepal. There is no clear-cut line. There are people who've got interests in both countries. Sometimes the line cuts through a field, through a house. So all this creates a problem, the conflict between the inherited identity and the modern identity. And how do you resolve that? I think that when we are dealing with our neighbors, we have to accept that this is so. So I think what we are doing is the right approach, at least now we are, maybe in the past we did not, is that one, we have to respect their sovereignty and treat them as sovereign nations, no problem. Two, we have to be magnanimous, generous, non-reciprocal. Treat them in an economic sense like some of your Indian states. Aisa dena hai, de do, koi baat nahi. It doesn't matter. Three, we feel that this will create long-term interdependencies. Because when they are benefiting from a good relationship with India, as say Bangladesh was, because you had so many agreements with them, you give them duty-free access, there's oil pipelines, power transmission lines, connectivity and so forth. Electricity is available. It's not easy to break away because irrespective of who is in power there. Take the Maldives, for example. Last year there was a lot of hand wringing. Oh, he has come to power with an India out agenda and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. But 7, 8 months later, it's okay because the realities kick in.
Yes.
So we have to be sometimes a little patient. And we have to make those countries realize that it is in your interest also to have a good relationship. I mean, they have to also start thinking, can we grow without India? Or would we be better off working with India? Because if India is growing as a major power in the world, then surely it makes sense, just common sense, that you try and get lifted along with India, the neighbors. After all, countries from across the world are trying to plug into India. Why not our neighbors who know much better how to deal with India? They have connections here. Or do they think that, by getting in foreign powers, getting Chinese money, that they're going to prosper? This is a question they have to answer themselves. But in the long run, one hopes that their self-interest will come into play and they would realize it. It's a slow process. Sometimes there are setbacks, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and so forth. But I think that on the whole, we have to be a little patient.
Patience.
Our neighbors also realize that when they are in difficulty, who will they turn to except India? During the COVID pandemic, you saw we are the ones who gave the vaccines.
Absolutely.
When there's a problem in the Maldives with water supply, we give it. Food, medicines, all go from India. If there's a tsunami, India is the first responder. If there is piracy, we will come in and help, as we did in the Maldives in 1988.
Yes.
So all these factors make for it, but it's a two-way process. We should be patient. It's not that we haven't made mistakes. I think mistakes have been made both at the government level and at the public level. At the government level, I think at times we have tended to be overbearing and they resent it.
Yeah.
At times we tend to neglect them and they don't like it. If we are to neglect them, as we are now telling to Pakistan, okay, you do your thing, we are no interest in it. It's a matter of deliberate policy, but it should not be some policy that is inadvertent. We should be giving them much more attention, making them feel that they're part of a larger community. We should be talking to them more. I personally think that there should be more interaction. Our leaders should be able to say, okay, I'm just taking a flight, go and have lunch, talk to my counterpart there, come back, or visit a pilgrimage site.
Right. Does the problem lie in the fact that India tries to be like an elder brother in most situations?
Well, you can't help it if you're an elder brother, I mean, what do you do? But you have to behave responsibly. Now, this I talked at the government level. At the public level, public also has to be aware that when you visit a neighboring country, you do not come across as an ugly Indian, where you say they're dismissive of whatever they are.
Got it.
That's very important. You have sometimes our people who go there and say, "Arey, ye to kya hai?" This is, who are these people? It's not very nice. So we have to be respectful of them, both at the governmental and at the public level.
Very true, sir. So how do we counter a situation like China, where China tries to poison the neighbors about us because they are trying to achieve some goals, their rise, and they are really insecure about India's rise simultaneously, and they try to put us down in our neighborhood? How do we counter that? Does your book cover that, sir?
Yes, very much in detail. I think China is a security and strategic problem or conundrum for us because, China matters to us both as a country which has become a neighbor, and therefore we have problems with them, whether it is boundary, Tibet, and so forth. And two, as a major power in the world, number 2 power in the world, which is following a deliberate policy of keeping India down. They have always been using Pakistan for many, many decades. But now, as their power and ambition have increased, they are all around us, in all our neighbors, in the Indian Ocean, and so forth. And they have the economic power, deep pockets, military, capabilities, and a clear strategic vision of what they would like to be. They have made no secret that they see themselves as a co-equal of the United States and hope to displace the United States as the number one power eventually. In order to do that, they first have to be number one in Asia. And this is where India becomes a stumbling block for them. How do they become a number one power in the world if they cannot be number one in Asia? So you have to tackle India. They would want to incorporate you at a lower level in a Sinocentric Asia or a Sinocentric world. India, and I speak not just for the government, but I think public too, will never accept that status. Do you want to be at a lower rung in a Sinocentric world? No. Our own sense of history, our self-achievements, our self-respect, our own ambitions say, no, we're not going to be there. And actually, the Chinese owe a lot to India. You know, when Mr. K.M. Panikkar, who was our ambassador in China, he was ambassador to the Kuomintang government and then later on to Mao's China. When he met Mao, after presenting credentials, Mao told him, he says, you know, in China we have a belief that if you have led a good and a virtuous life, then you will be reborn in the Western kingdom, which is India. Buddhism, where did it come from? From India. The Chinese monks and the famous ones, Huanzhuang and Fa Yan and others, came to India looking for knowledge. So there is something that China owes India. They, of course, now pretend that everything that is good and was originated in China. But there is this problem that how do they get India to keep India down? And Pakistan is a tool, others are a tool, because that way India will never be able to realize its full potential. So there's the border dispute. They don't want to settle the border dispute. Because what does it mean? It means that more of our resources are now on the border, particularly after Galwan 2020 and so forth. We've had to shift a lot of our forces there. And that is why defenses on the Jammu front are a little thin. So you see a lot more terrorist activity in the Jammu area now, because a lot of the forces have been shifted from Jammu to the Chinese border. They don't want to settle it. They say Arunachal Pradesh is a part of Tibet, it's South Tibet. Obviously, we cannot accept that. So there's a huge clash of interests there. And we earlier had accepted that this is 54 and then subsequently also that we recognize Tibet as an autonomous region of China. But of late, we've stopped saying that. We no longer talk about it. We have contacts now with Dalai Lama. Prime Minister met him a few years ago, I'm told. And the head of their government in exile was invited to the swearing-in ceremony. The Chinese get very upset when our leaders visit Arunachal Pradesh, especially Tawang. So all this means that it's a big problem, because the Chinese understand that Tibet is culturally, historically, linguistically much closer to India than to China. They're trying to erase all the history and culture of Tibet. It's only in India that we have preserved and supported Tibetan language, culture, etc. Now, we still have the Dalai Lama with us, but a few years from now, we don't know what will happen. They'll produce their own new Dalai Lama. Somebody will be born in Tawang or Dharamsala or whatever. Again, there'll be a conflict. Mm-hmm. So the China problem is going to remain, it's our number one issue.
True. When we speak about China problem, it's not just the border dispute or the trade, but we how do we balance it nicely? Because after the Galwan attack in 2020, we saw that we had put a stop on the trade with China, which was the right decision according to me, sir. But now we see 2024, Chinese is the biggest exporter to India now again.
How do you ignore a country which is the manufacturing hub of the world, which is dominating electronics, batteries, solar panels, electrical vehicles, a lot of machinery, equipment, even low-end stuff. As I mentioned, a lot of our industry has been hollowed out because the Chinese have set up a system and they have the advantage of being an authoritarian country, which we don't, or most other countries don't, where they get land very cheap, they get credit very cheap, they can set up huge industrial hubs, no labor problems. Whereas in India, you saw what happened when we tried to have the farm laws, labor laws. Can't get it through because you couldn't have a political consensus. So how do you compete with China? And then they provide a lot of the input for your own exports. But take pharmaceuticals, which is a big export from India. The active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. We were manufacturing them earlier, but now the Chinese start producing them much cheaper. And our companies
Can't sustain.
can't compete with that. You take small things. You remember locks from Aligarh, famous locks. Now you have all these stupid Chinese locks which are coming much cheaper.
They're stop now, the Aligarh companies.
So they have hollowed out our manufacturing. The other day I went looking for an air purifier. I couldn't find any in the market which was not manufactured in China. And I went around to so many shops. Finally, I found a Hitachi, which was twice as expensive. Today, you can't find a toaster which is made in India. So this is a problem that we have. That how do we do without the Chinese import? Because either you have substitutes from other countries, but no, everyone else is dependent on China. The Europeans, the Americans, they're all dependent on China for many of their manufacturing. Or our public has to be willing to say, no, I'm not going to buy Chinese products. I'd rather pay more for a made in India product.
Yes.
Is our public willing to do that? I think this is where, foreign policy needs to come to the public and say, okay, what is at stake? You cannot say that I'm going to buy the cheapest phone, but then I don't like China. Why is there such a trade deficit? Because you and I are contributing to it.
So this thing looks good on paper about how high the manufacturing is and their supply through the rest of the world. But while I was speaking to a Chinese expert in India, Professor Shrikant Kondapalli, realizing that there is so much internal problem inside China because of this situation that they've created for their citizens in terms of the kind of lifestyle that they created. There's internal, it looks good on paper, but again, the nation goes through a lot of adversities.
Yeah, no, I think that Professor Kondapalli is right. I think that China has huge internal problems. I think it is in India's interest to try and see how we can exploit those. They are exploiting our weaknesses. So if they have weaknesses, and I liken China to a pressure cooker. In every home, Indian home certainly, there's a pressure cooker. And the housewife knows that if the pressure cooker is letting off steam, there's a whistle every few minutes, things are okay. It's when the whistle stops blowing that you have a problem. Now in India, there's whistles blowing all the time. There's something or the other which is happening. If it's not one thing, it's another thing. So you got little eruptions all over. But this is, for India, a safety mechanism. Some pressure is being released all the time. There are no whistles blowing in China. And therefore, if any explosion happens, it will be a big explosion. That's what I think. And if you look at the history of China, they've always had violent upheavals. 19th century, 20th century, violent upheavals. In India, there's been a constant kind of, lots of problems all the time, sometimes here, sometimes there, some caste, some religion, some falana, all that. But in the long run, I suppose India has these safety mechanisms. China does not, in my view. And today, the Western world, which helped in the rise of China could not have risen without American and Western support.
Absolutely.
Is realizing that now China is creating a threat for them, and therefore they are clamping down. If Mr. Trump comes to power in America, we'll see an even more tight thing. Even the Europeans, who were, focused only on the economic aspects of their relationship, even they are getting worried. And now here, the Indian market is important for China because it's a growing market. So they want access to it. And they say, no, let's leave proper place for the border dispute. Let's get on with other things. We are saying no. That's why we walked out of the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Because we realized that already the Chinese are using these FTA routes to enter the Indian market by abusing them. And we don't want to give them more access to the Indian market. And if their access to European and American markets is now being restricted by the policies of those countries, then we don't want to give them our market.
Yeah.
Necessarily. But we also have some necessities. We have to buy some things. We need some things. So how do we find the right balance? That is the conundrum.
I have a couple of more questions on your book. So one is, does your book cover on the aspect of Pakistan? Because recently Pakistan had invited India for the SCO summit as well. So what is your book's take on the India-Pakistan relation? Very briefly, if you could. We don't want to give importance to Pakistan as much.
The whole of India thinks about Pakistan. But I think the future is quite bleak. Because so long as the army is in power there, whether directly or behind the scenes, they need an enemy to justify the expenditure and the perks that the army enjoys. And sometimes even when you get the army on board, as Manmohan Singh and Musharraf tried through the back channel talks, you have the political parties which come in. And if the political parties, if they are not fighting with one another, then you have the judiciary which comes in. And then you have also outside powers like China and sometimes the United States in the past, which were playing a policy of keeping India-Pakistan confrontation. So unless there's a sea change in Pakistan thinking, which doesn't look likely just now, I don't see any future prospects of any meaningful dialogue with Pakistan. I mean, the only thing we want to talk to them about is terrorism. Jammu and Kashmir is over. As the minister said the other day at my book launch, he says 370 is done. Now what are you going to talk about? Okay, when will you give us back POK? We're not going to talk to Pakistan about the status of J&K. Some of these political parties in Kashmir are saying we must have dialogue. Dialogue about what? And there's also the problem that I think over the years, the education system of Pakistan, the propaganda of Pakistan, the influence of the Islamists in Pakistan, all that has created a very negative atmosphere about India in Pakistan. And I don't see any early solution to our problems with Pakistan. We have to live with it.
So an important part of India's foreign policy, as said by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is our soft power.
Soft power is important, but it has to complement hard power. Soft power means that you have to reach out to people. I think we need to do a lot more in this regard. And what I talked about, our neighbors, that how do our people behave and so forth, that is important. We must engage more of their intellectual and academic elite, try and get more students, get more people from the media, build up constituencies in these countries. Of course, our soft power in terms of entertainment and so forth is already there. Your films, your music and so forth, they get attracted to India. But we must reach out to the youth in particular, One of the problems I see is that when our own youth is always scrambling to go abroad, then young people from our neighboring countries also are aspiring to go to Australia, Canada, UK, USA and so forth. Earlier, India used to be a preferred destination for students. And we did help a lot. But, our facilities are inadequate. I mean, our own medical students are going to all kinds of countries for medical education. Then when we get the students and young people here, How do we treat them? How does public treat them? Do they feel welcome here? That's where ordinary people have to play a role. It's not just the government, because at a daily level, a student in a university, a professor here, a visiting businessman, a patient who's come to a medical hospital, do they feel welcome, or do they feel discriminated against, or do we look down upon them? All these things matter. So soft power involves people-to-people contact, but that means that the people of our country have a role to play in this matter. And, I think that is where people in India must understand the larger context of our foreign policy challenges. It's not something only for the government, it is for people to people also.
So I would like to break down my next questions into two parts. First is that recently I recorded a video on how it's high time that India should become a member of the UNSC, United Nations Security Council, and various reasons to it. What is your take on that? And the second is, how does your book place India in the fight for superpower?
India and the UN Security Council, we had the chances, we missed them. In the 50s, or 40s, late 40s, early 50s, the Americans suggested to us through Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was our ambassador in USA, that what would India say to taking China's place in the Security Council? And Nehruji said, no, he was so enamored of China. No. China must have its place. India will have its own place. This kind of romanticized thinking. Then later on, the Russians suggested to us. Again, we turned it down. We made mistakes. Look, the UN Security Council P5 is an exclusive club. Nobody wants to get out of that club. Nobody wants another member on that club. Yes, there are countries which are supportive of India being there, and they say it to make India feel nice and good. And maybe some of them actually really supportive. But it is always going to be a fight to get onto the high table. In international affairs, power is always taken, never given.
Very true.
So we have to fight our way to the top. And that is what our strategy has to be. What kind of coalitions we build, what kind of leverages we have, what are our strengths, how to maximize our strengths, overcome our weaknesses. Now, the UN Security Council, it is prestigious because if you have a veto, then it can't pass any resolution against you. But it has become a completely ineffective body because the members of the Security Council are fighting amongst themselves. There's America against China, against Russia, the Europeans also with the Americans. So the primary purpose of the UN Security Council is maintenance of peace and security. Now you have one member of the permanent member of the Security Council, America, saying it wants a strategic defeat of another member, Russia. So what is the Security Council? That's why it doesn't meet and take any meaningful decisions. You have this war raging in Gaza and the Middle East. And nobody can call out Israel because the Americans are giving it that support. And it threatens to become a wider war. Nothing is happening. What was your second question?
About what your book suggests, how does India become on the global stage of superpower?
Oh, there are, and this is the concluding part of my book, there are 5 elements I have outlined. Number 1 is the concept of strategic autonomy. We have to take our own decisions. We must be in a position to take our own decisions, what is in our own interest. We have to resist the pressures. Nobody is going to give you a security. We are too big, and I don't think that we want to be reliant on another country for our security. We don't have any nuclear umbrella. We won't get it. So the decision we took to develop our own nuclear weapons was the right one. You cannot be an ally of any group. We had non-alignment earlier. So today, when Ambassador Garcetti says there can be no strategic autonomy when it comes to a matter of war, I respectfully disagree. This is not India's war. This is a European war that the Americans are fighting in Ukraine. Americans, through their ambassador, are saying, you cannot have strategic autonomy. Does India accept that? No. So I think there is a general consensus that we must have strategic autonomy, independent foreign policy, take decisions on merit. Number two, you have to develop your economic, military, scientific, technological capabilities. That's where Make in India, Atmanirbharta need to do more on research. Our private sector and government need to put in a lot more money on research, basic research, give some incentives to our industry to do research in this. We have to do a lot more in the field of health, education. We must be a more focused country looking at new areas of technology. And we have the many advantages. We have a demographic dividend which may not last beyond a few more decades. But then you need to have a well-educated, you must have a healthy population. That is the second aspect. The economic, scientific, technological, other military independence as far as possible and development. So that is why we need good relations with countries like the United States and Europe, because they are still the source of technology for us. We have to develop our own technologies. We see how we can leverage our diaspora. Our diaspora in the United States and in the West is doing so well. How can we attract them back? If tomorrow 1 million technically qualified Indians decide that the atmosphere in India is right and they want to come back, there'll be panic in America. But then we have to create the right conditions, the right ecosystem, which would encourage them to come back. We must encourage our young people that, look, if you are Indian, are living in India, work for India. 3, I think I've mentioned about India as the center of Asia. So that is a geopolitical advantage. Never forget, geography matters. Geopolitics is about geography. So we are in the heart of Asia. And around us, we have abundant sources of energy, which I call the arc of energy, Persian Gulf, Caspian Sea, Russia, Siberia, Far East, sab hai. You have the arc of prosperity to our east. The Southeast Asian countries, the East Asian countries, they're rich, prosperous, population is good, good markets for us. We have cultural and other people-to-people connections. That's the arc of prosperity. The third is the arc of communications, the Indian Ocean. We have open seas on both sides, on 3 sides, Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, Indian Ocean. The only islands, worthwhile islands, are under our control, Andaman and Nicobar. Look at China, it's got so many obstacles there. Your fourth arc is the arc of instability. That's a problem. Around us, go to the west, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. How do we handle that? And the fifth arc is the arc of uncertainty to the north. We talked about China, Tibet. Central Asian countries are also a little uncertain. What happens there? Now, India is at the intersection of these arcs. There's also Africa, huge resources are there next door. So we are in the heart of Asia. And that is what makes India so pivotally important. But then our geopolitical weaknesses are also there. Our neighbors, which we discussed. How do we tackle, overcome these weaknesses, take advantage of our geopolitical situation? The fourth, good leadership. You must have a leadership which thinks big, which thinks strategically, which thinks long-term. And here, I think that Prime Minister Modi does do that. He has a vision for India. This is what I want in 2047. This is what I want in the next decade. He's constantly looking for new things, how to make India a developed country. So you must have, and I hope that in the coming decades, subsequent leaders will also have a similar perspective. And finally, sections of our political and intellectual elite must get over their regrettable tendency to seek foreign interference in our affairs. Come, save our democracy. What's going on? We don't need more Mir Jafars and Jaychands in India. Please. India has suffered because our own people have let us down in the past. One of the defects we Indians have is that if one of us is doing well, we'll pull him down. But if a foreigner comes and kicks us, we will accept it. Have we changed? Shouldn't we change? Why do we need to appeal to foreigners to interfere in our internal affairs? What locus standi do they have? Why do our Indians who go abroad, or even in India, sections of our people, criticize India constantly? India is bad, this, that, and the other. Why? You have so many Indian academics sitting in comfortable jobs in American and UK universities, constantly criticizing India. They have nothing good to say about India. Why? You should be talking up your country, not talking down your country. So if these things happen, then I think we'll get our place in the world.
Wow. So I would take this opportunity to congratulate on your new book. And I'm sure the audience, after listening to you on your perspective, will have the urge to pick a copy for you. And I'll put the description of the book on Amazon, on our description for them to buy. And this has been so good conversation, such eye-opening for me as well. But before that, we have a tradition at Diary of a Publisher that the last guest leaves a question for you. The question was on strategic autonomy. You already answered, but I'll take the opportunity to have a question thrown at you from me. That is, sir, India has a lot of good strategic thinkers. You are one of them. I would say that. Do you think these suggestions, these policy suggestions, goes to the leadership to make the decision right? Because the perspective that you hold on China, on other subjects that we are these perspectives reaching the top management and top leadership in our country, sir?
As you know, I had my book release on Friday. It is 3 days ago. Minister of External Affairs, Dr. Jaishankar, did the book release. I would urge everyone to listen to that, what he had to say, because obviously he has gone through my book and he commented on every aspect of it in great detail. He was supposed to speak for 10-15 minutes. He spoke for almost 40 minutes. So yes, certainly Dr. Jaishankar has read my book and he's offered his comments in public on what he thought of my book. There are many things with which he and I are on the same page. There are others where he has a different perspective, and that is fine. Because in writing this book, my idea was never to thrust my views on anyone. It's a point of view based on my own experience, thinking, and analysis. I could be wrong, but if it stimulates other people to think, other Indians to think, whether in government or outside, and if it can lead to a better policy formulation and better behavior on part of Indians, and understanding of what all this means for ordinary people, then my purpose is being served. So I would like a debate on these issues. Think about it yourself, because, this Viksit Bharat will not happen in my lifetime. It'll happen in your lifetime. So you have a stake in which way India goes. My children and my grandchildren have a stake in this. And therefore, it is important that young people should think about these issues.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you so much. Sir, I would end our conversation with 2 personal questions, if you allow me, sir.
Yeah.
One is, any book that you wish you would have read earlier in life so that you had the wisdom that you hold now, you could have gotten before?
Wisdom doesn't come from reading books. They can stimulate you, but ultimately the wisdom has to come from within and your own experiences with life. I mean, obviously I couldn't have written a book like this when I started my career. And what I have written is based on obviously my diplomatic experience, my academic experience, my study as a student of history, my experience in different countries. All that goes together and of course, you have to think about issues, because when you read a book, you're only getting somebody else's knowledge.
True.
So that can be a tool to stimulate your own thinking. And ultimately, you have to think out things in your own mind. That this is the thing.
And connect with experiences.
Yeah. connect it with your own experiences. And, all of us, if we look at our respective lives, we'll find that sometimes, it is the failures in life which have been the greatest lessons for us. If you're to always succeed, there's no challenge. But when you have a little setback, then it sets you thinking why, how could it not be? And that is important.
But is there any book that you want to advise the audience to put a hands on, sir?
Oh, well, on foreign policy, I've got a little bibliography.
Could be on life, sir. Could be on life, about maybe spirituality, whatever has changed your perspective on life.
Well, if you're talking about life and spirituality, I would strongly recommend every Indian to read and understand Swami Vivekananda. In my view, he was one of the greatest Indians in recent decades. He died at a very young age of 39. But there was so much wisdom and profound insight into what he said. In fact, I have put together, because I started reading Vivekananda 25 years ago, and then got busy with work, and then I resumed it. So I went through his entire works, complete works, 9 volumes. And I found it fascinating. So I started taking some notes for my own reference. And then I just shared it with the Vivekananda International Foundation. I said, look, this is it. Maybe, you've got scholars, etc., who do it. And then a suggestion came that, why don't you have a book on it? So I worked on a book. There's a manuscript. And what I have tried to do there is to not interpret him too much, but cull out his wisdom and put it there for the readers in his own words to judge. So he had a lot to say, of course, about religion, spirituality, about other religions, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, our Gita, Krishna, about Karma Yoga, Raj Yoga, Gyan Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. But he also had a lot to say about society and the nation. And what he had to say about youth, women, caste, education, how he tried to inspire young people. And one of the most fascinating elements is how to make India great again, which is so relevant today. And I'll just conclude by quoting what I said in the book release function also. He said that 2 things. One, he said, you have to have strength. You must be strong. That's essential. And number 2, you must have faith. You must have faith in yourself. If you have faith, you can do anything. But if you believe that you are a weakling, that you can't achieve, you will never achieve it. I mean, you take in our everyday life, a student wants to be top of the class. A sportsman wants to win the gold medal. So what do we as a country want, as a people want? And he said, the Englishman thinks that he can do anything. He has faith. I can. Today, of course, the Englishmen have lower ambitions, but the Americans think, we are number one. We will stay number one. We want to stay number one. We'll do everything to make that possible. The Chinese, we talked about it. They say, we are number one. We are going to be number one. So what does India think? Do you want to be number one? If you don't even aspire to it, you'll never become number one. So that is my message, that have faith, have confidence, have a vision, and work towards it.
Absolutely, sir. Such an inspiring conversation I've had with you, sir. So much to take from you, and I'm sure the audience had a lot as well. I would like to thank you again.
Very happy to be with you, to have had this conversation.
Thank you for sparing the time, sir.
My pleasure.
An honor.
We at TOAP are working really hard to take this podcast to the next level. Our guests are going to get even better. Our production quality is going to get even better. And hopefully, I'm going to get even better too. Most importantly, we are committed to being consistent and continue to do what we love the most. Until then, keep reimagining yourself and know that the power of change lies within you. Jai Hind.